Maurizio Giuliano. Maurizio Giuliano, born 1975, is an Italian United Nations official, traveler, author, and journalist. As of 2004, he was, according to the Guinness Book of World Records, the youngest person to have visited all sovereign nations of the world, aged 28 years and 361 days. He has worked for various international organizations in the field of media relations. Personal life and education. Giuliano is the son of a lawyer father and a housewife mother. He has lived in Cuba, Chile, and Indonesia. After completing high school in Milan and in Manchester, he earned a degree from the University of Oxford in 1996 and a master's degree from the University of Cambridge in 1997. At University College, Oxford, he studied philosophy, politics, and economics, specializing in Latin America and Eastern Europe. While at Oxford, he was a member of the Oxford University Elchame Society. As of 1998, he was a researcher at the Center for Social Studies CESAC in Santiago, Chile. Writings. Academic work on Cuba. He authored 2 books and some academic articles on Cuban politics, focusing among other things on the U.S. embargo, which he claimed in the book La Transición Cubana y el Bloqueo Norteamericano, and other works, has a strong counterproductive effect in supporting the continuation of Cuba's regime. In the book and other writings, Giuliano staunchly contested the view that an end to the Castro regime would be near, and expressed the view that any transition would be slow and gradual. In an article published in the British academic journal Democratization in 1998, he focused in particular on how the U.S. embargo against Cuba helps create empathy by third parties towards Cuba, which is then domestically perceived as support towards Cuba's regime. He argued, hence, that the U.S. government, in addition to the embargo's direct influence on supporting Cuba's regime, indirectly inhibits potentially constructive pressures towards change, insofar as third countries, foreign non-governmental organizations, and prominent individuals lend support to Cuba's resistance to the U.S. embargo, and this offsets external pressures. Purge of Havana's Center for American Studies (CA) his scholarly work on internal Cuban politics, notably on the 1996 purge of Havana's Center for American Studies (CA) contained in the book El Caso CA, published in 1998, has been the object of academic reviews, as it exposed the internal conflicts between Cuba's political apparatus and the country's intelligentsia, previously unknown. According to some reviews, the book, a work of investigative journalism complemented by academic analysis, dealt a strong blow to hardliners within the regime by exposing for the first time the internal conflicts between Cuba's apparatus and its intelligentsia. In 2001, Cuban exiled scholars Alberto Alvarez and Gerardo Gonzalez, who were among those purged from the CA, wrote the book Intelectuales vs. Revolution. El Caso del Centro de Estudios Saber America, which strongly built upon Giuliano's book to offer further insights on relations between Cuba's political apparatus. Along with these 2 scholars, and Giuliano, Cuban sociologist Haroldo de la Alfonso expressed the view that the purge mechanisms described in Giuliano's book have been a key pillar for the regime's ability to prevent the rise of reformers, and that such dynamics remain in place as late as 2016. Journalism. Besides work on Cuba, other countries Giuliano covered in his journalistic work include East Timor and Myanmar, Burma. In 1993, he worked for the Austrian weekly magazine Profil, for which he interviewed Mikhail Gorbachev, who expressed criticism at the reforms carried out by Russian President Boris Yeltsin, when Yeltsin called a referendum for 25 April 1993 in an attempt to achieve even greater powers as president, Gorbachev told. In his journalistic work, he reportedly ran into problems with the authorities of at least 2 countries. On 16 August 1998, he was denied entry to Myanmar after making contact with the National League for Democracy and meeting its leader Aung San Suu Kyi, with Myanmar authorities accusing him of falsely claiming to be a tourist and of illegally gathering news, which prompted condemnations by organizations such as the International Federation of Journalists and Reporters Without Borders. While on 30 October 2002, he was reportedly detained and manhandled by Israeli authorities while crossing the Allenby Bridge, which also prompted condemnation by Reporters Without Borders. Giuliano, however, describes his worst authorities-related odyssey as he was traveling in 2003 around the South Pacific, where authorities in New Zealand and some South Pacific islands reportedly caused serious hindrance to his movements for the simple fact that he appeared to be suspicious because of his strange travel patterns. Giuliano's writings have also included lighter topics. During his time in Kabul, for example, he wrote restaurant reviews for a local English-language magazine. Political advocacy. In the early 2000s, Giuliano was a consultant for the Italian Senate's Committee on Human Rights. At that time, some of his writings were intended to influence the positions of the Italian government on certain human rights issues, as was the case with material that he wrote on North Korea. Development career. In 2004, Giuliano worked for the International Organization for Migration in the elections for Afghan refugees in Pakistan, where he advocated for turnout by potential voters in spite of precarious security conditions. And in 2005, he worked in Afghanistan for the United Nations Development Programme's Justice Division, which endeavored to reform the country's legal system. In both cases, he was working in the field of communications with the media. He worked for the United Nations, again in the field of media relations in Central African Republic in 2006, where he denounced very low levels of funding for a neglected emergency and called Western governments to be generous in saving lives of the most vulnerable Central Africans. He moved to Sudan in 2007, where he vocally denounced abuses by increasingly fragmented armed groups as well as access constraints caused by the Sudanese government, and called for more funding also in response to floods that hit the city of Kassala. In 2008, he was posted to Chad, calling for more international attention amidst conflict between Chadian and pro-Sudanese forces which displaced more than 500,000 people, and with the events culminating in the Battle of N'Djamena of February 2008, after which he worked in Cameroon following the refugee crisis caused by war and asking. In 2009 and 2010 he worked in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where he denounced attacks by warring parties against civilians and the use of rape as a weapon of war, referring to rape as a pandemic and plague. He denounced the brutality of expulsions between the DRC and Angola, alleging that both countries were committing rapes of illegal immigrants who were being deported and urging them to investigate the allegations on both sides of the border. In response to Giuliano's criticism about the extent of rape in the country, Congo's government spokesperson Lambert Mende dubbed him as the rape spokesperson. In 2010, he was UN spokesperson for the 2010 Pakistan floods. He warned of an impending second wave of death that would result from post-flood disease and food shortages, stating that 3.5 million children were at risk of death if they did not get assistance, including due to cholera. He stated that an already colossal disaster was getting worse and requiring an even more colossal response, referring to the relief operations as a marathon at sprint pace, and giving figures of up to 1 million people displaced in 48 hours. He argued that the needs outpaced available resources, also due to endless rains. In response to Taliban threats to attack relief workers, Giuliano stated that they would not be intimidated by such threats and would continue working. He indicated that the floods had a worse impact than several other recent natural disasters combined, becoming the worst natural disaster in United Nations history. He attracted criticism for exaggerating the extent of the emergency, but was also credited for bringing attention to it. In 2014 and 2015, he headed the Office of the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs (OCHA) in the DRC city of Bunia, where he denounced continued abuses by multiple militia groups against civilians in particular the Front for Patriotic Resistance in Ituri FRPI and the Ugandan Allied Democratic Forces ADF. He considered that serious atrocities and human rights abuses in Ituri were not getting sufficient international attention and called for robust protection efforts and funding to meet humanitarian needs. He also advocated for reinforced accountability to recipients of assistance. Travel. According to the Guinness Book, through his work, he had traveled to every single sovereign country in the world, which totaled 193 according to the Guinness Book by 20 February 2004. He claimed that he had visited a total of up to 238 territories, including the 193 sovereign countries recognized by Guinness, and stated that North Korea had been the hardest country to get into after numerous attempts and long waits to get a visa, followed by a visit during which he was never let alone by his tour guides. His Sudanese visa was also particularly difficult to obtain, involving a wait of nearly a year. In 1992, he had his passport stolen in Albania and reported difficulties obtaining a new one from the Italian embassy, supposedly due to a Neapolitan clerk mistaking him for an Albanian because of his Milanese accent. He started traveling at the age of 14 and believes that, as of 2004, he had traveled at least 2 million miles, including on the Trans-Siberian Railway and through 11 round-the-world air journeys. Some of his earliest journeys were to Albania and Sierra Leone in 1991, aged 16, and to Mongolia in 1992 on the occasion of the national festivities Nadam. During his early travels he often stayed with pen pals. Most of his later travels were related to his journalistic work. He stated that in some countries he lived or spent months, while in others he spent mere hours, his shortest stay being a 1-hour visit to Tuvalu with Air Fiji. On 20 February 2004, he arrived in Suriname on a Brazilian airliner, thereby completing his visit to all sovereign nations of the world. He held a press conference there on 24 February, where he stated that he had chosen Suriname to complete his record, as the country had always fascinated him due to its richness and variety in cultures and ethnicities. He then traveled from Suriname to London with 42 passports, 30 Italian and 12 British filled with immigration stamps, in order to prove his record with Guinness World Records. He claimed that most of his travels were unrelated to the record, and that only since 2001, on the suggestion of friends, he had the Guinness record in mind when planning his travels. In explaining his record, however, he stated that he might be affected by an addiction to crossing borders. Collecting passport stamps as proof of travels was a major part of Giuliano's endeavor, and he describes being obsessed about his stamps to the extent that he traveled with ink pads in 5 different colors so that he could assist immigration officers whose stamps may lack ink.